Hi, this is Lindsay Austin with Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. I have with me Andrea Ukrop, and we're here to do a training on the HOPWA year-end report. And we'll do an overview of the CAPER, and we're going to talk about getting started. And Andrea is going to walk you through the actual workbooks. We're going to talk about using CAMs and the workflow of submitting the reports and any other important dates that we have. First of all, the HOPWA CAPER is a DHCD requirement that we must submit to HUD. And this is part of our overall consolidated planning process. The data for the HOPWA CAPER is collected through a workbook, and it is exactly the same as last year. A few things that we want to talk about. The HOPWA CAPER report. One, you're going to get a file that is your workbook. Do not change the name of the file. Workbooks will be sent to the organizations. You may have that right now. If you are not the main contact that should have this workbook, please let us know who is. Detailed instructions will be sent to you. If you do not have them, somebody else at your organization may already have them. We will give you details of exactly how to walk through this workbook, get familiar with the layout of the workbook because it is the same as last year, but it is a big workbook with many tabs. Last year's workbook that you completed could be a very useful guide to pull up to complete some information that might be exactly the same as last year. And we also want to remind you that in these workbooks are some bolded sections where there are auto checks for the data. So right now I'm going to stop sharing and Andrea is going to share and we're going to step through each of the tabs in this workbook.
All right. So I am going to walk through the tabs. This year we are using a blank workbook, but I'm going to do my best as I go through to highlight the areas that I am referencing in the notebook. You can generally go straight to the identification tab. This information is pre-populated by HUD. There should not be any changes necessary, but do make sure that your organization is listed here as the sponsor for the HOPWA projects. On the data quality tab, we are going to go through this a couple of times, or at least mention it a couple of times as we go through the tabs, because there is some information depending on how responses are recorded in this workbook where you may need to provide additional information. And quickly you can see that each tab has a place for comments. So anything you need to let us know, even outside where we let you guys know that a comment is needed, please do so there. In the past, it was done through an email, and then we learned last year that this tab was added. So this is a great addition to the workbook. On the HOPWA provider. So most likely, unless there have been staff changes, you can go back to your final workbook last year and see who was entered and the information that was entered here. Just a couple of notes that in row 4, this is your organization's UEI. You can take that from last year's workbook, or that's also something you can find in CAMS, just as an FYI. Here for row 6, you are wanting to provide information from the last completed contract between July 1, 2025 and June 30th, 2026. As we move on down to row 27, here, this needs to add up to all of the money that was expended on administration costs, which is here in row 28. I believe that is going to be populated based on responses here. For technical assistance in row 29 and resource identification in row 30, though both of those cells should be 0. Okay, we're going to move on to contact information. Again, this is one where you may want to check with your previous workbook from last year. And just as a reminder, if you do not have different people in these categories, then you will need to have the same person. There are some organizations who have the same person listed in all 3 categories as the primary program contact, the secondary contact, and the contact for the individual seeking services. Okay, we're going to move on now to demographics and prior living. So for section 2, remember that there is only one individual within the household that makes that household eligible. And here for section 2, rows 4 through 13, and across the columns, this is one where you're going to want to remember to slide over to see the entire contents of this tab. You're going to want to do the demographic information, sex, age, and race, ethnicity, to the most applicable answers. There are no other categories other than those that are listed. So you and your organization need to make the best decisions on how you report these demographic categories of the people you are serving in your project. In section 2, these are going to be those who made the household eligible. And here in section 15, these are going to be any other household members. So those would be included here. Let's take a look at row 29 now. So this is going to be the number of other household members, otherwise known as beneficiaries, who are HIV positive. Let's take a look now at row 30. How many household individuals are negative to HIV? So here it is going to subtract out, and you can see the data section, the sum of 29 and 30, and that must be must equal the total number served here in row 28. All right, let's move down to section 31 or row 31. This is only to be completed on those who receive TBRA or permanent housing placement assistance. Those are the only 2 categories of assistance that you are going to record responses for. And here we have in row 32, this is going to be individuals that stayed in the project this fiscal year that were also served last fiscal year. So anybody who did not exit last fiscal year, you will need to enter that information here in row 32. In rows 34 through 48, you are going to record the number of clients who exited during the FY26 fiscal year, and you will record those according to how according to their outcomes. Additionally, in row 49, this will be pre-populated. And then in rows 51 and 52, the individuals cannot be greater than the response in row 49. So here in row 49, we're looking at those who were experiencing homelessness, and you cannot have somebody who was not experiencing homelessness that is chronically homeless, and then they're also asking about those veterans. We're going to move on to leverage, and we want to note that the expectation is that all organizations have leverage. So please note that if your organization does not have any kind of leverage, so that would be funding that you use for eligible costs, HOPWA eligible costs, but it comes from another funding source. That is what leverage is. You would want to make sure that is recorded here for these particular categories at the top, and then for any other funding sources down below at 13 all the way down to 27. As a note, Ryan White here, you can see, is a funding source that is most likely leverage. All right, we're now going to move down to program income here for row 29 and 30. As a reminder, grantees should not be collecting program income, so these should be 0. And then again, since there are no, should not be collecting program income, then 32 and 33 should also be 0. Unless you are paying 100% of rent to a landlord, then we would expect to see how much residents pay directly to the private landlord. And this should be calculated when you are determining the 30% of the income that a client is required to pay. And the only time that that would be 0 is when the client's income is also 0. All right. On to TBRA. So rows 41 and 47 are pre-populated, and they must equal the number of people served here in row 4. Also note that sources of income must be equal to or greater than the number of individuals served by this assistance, and sources of medical insurance can be equal to, less than, or the same as the number of individuals served by assistance. So here on row 5, these are the total funds expended for TBRA. So this should be a number. And you can And you will want to make sure that is a number and not a narrative. If we move on down to row 6 through 8, so here 7 and 8, you are going to be putting your responses. And if those must equal 0, because we're not using other rental assistance. So you would not need to provide a response here in number 9. Row 11 here, we're looking at income. And this is must equal the total number of eligible households when it pre-populates here. So you'll provide your responses from 12 through 14, and it will pre-populate or auto-populate in row 11. In row 16, how many households accessed or maintain access to the following sources of income? So again, these are going to pre-populate, and here you have the number of households that had no income. So that must be at least the number of households served, if not greater. We are going to now look at row 39 and 40. So these are the outcomes. So it does not have to equal the individual total. However, if you are reporting 0 on either of these rows, then you will need to provide an explanation back on the data quality tab that we mentioned before under the TBRA section. Then rows 41, you will be completing 42 through 46. And that must equal the total number of households that receive TBR assistance, and the same for the outcome section as well. Okay. So now we have a couple of super easy tabs. We do not provide funding for PFBH or STTFBH, so you will not need to complete those tabs at all. For STRUMU, if assistance is reported in the household served by this activity, STRUMU breakdown, sections 4 through 6, then you will need to provide the expenditures for those categories below in section 8, rows 10 through 13. Again, sources of income must be equal to or greater than the number of individuals served by this assistance, which we're at STRUMU now, and the sources of medical insurance may, but do not need to equal the number of individuals served by the assistance. We're going to move on down to the income levels for the household, and that is row 15. So again, that is going to auto-populate based on the rows in 16 through 18. Now we're going to move on down to row 42, and this is longevity. So rows 42 through 46, the total in row 42 does not need to equal the total for those who receive this assistance. However, it cannot be greater than the total eligible households that were reported back up in row 8. So that's just a good data check. All right, and then let's finish up with rows 49 through 69. again, we are looking at anybody who in row 48 who continued receiving services past June 30th of 2025. So anybody from last fiscal year that continues to receive funding in this fiscal year. And then you want to report the outcomes of all of those individuals, households who exited this fiscal year.
Andrea,
Yes.
quick, go back up to that section.
Okay.
It is how many households continue to receive this type of HOPWA assistance into the next year. So if they didn't exit the program and they're continuing on into the next program, that number would go in there.
I am sorry. So that's anybody who did not exit this year, as opposed to what I said last year. I am sorry. And yes, thank you, Lindsay, for making that correction. So anybody who's continuing to receive services next fiscal year, that is the number that will go in row 48. All right. So now we're on to permanent housing placement. Not all agencies receive funding for permanent housing placement. So if your agency does not receive funding per your budget for permanent housing placement, you will not need to complete this section. And then also, again, the same note about sources of income that must be equal to or greater than the number of individuals served by the assistance, and sources of medical insurance may but do not need to equal the number of individuals served by the assistance. We will also look here at row 6. This needs to be a dollar amount and not a narrative. So this would be the amount of money that was spent on permanent housing placement. And now we are going to look at rows 32 through 34 here. And these are mutually exclusive and must equal the total number of eligible households served by this assistance back up in row 4 here. So how many households were served with the permanent housing placement assistance? If any individuals did not have a housing outcome listed here that did exit, you will need to provide an explanation again here in the data quality note tab under permanent housing placement. Okay, and a similar note for housing information. Not all grantees receive information regarding housing and receive funding regarding housing information. If you do not need to complete this tab. For those who do, make sure that row 6 here in this column is a dollar amount and not a narrative. We have changed up our instructions just a little bit for supportive services. So I hope this clears up some confusion that we have had in years past. So if your organization reports services here, these are only services paid with HOPWA funds granted by DHCD. So if you provide any of these services, then you will then need to provide the dollar amount here in in column C. We do want to note that case management is required here. So case management is required. However, if it is provided using another funding source, you do not need to provide a total number of households or the expenditure amount. However, you will need to provide an explanation again in the data quality notes under supportive services. So that is a change from the past. Those dollars can come from another funding source. We just need to know that case management is being provided. Okay, so if we look at row 18 and 19, so that should be 0. There's specific types of funding for this. This is not funding that we have. So those are always going to be 0 or left blank. In 21, so here, if you are providing more than one type of assistance, here, then you are going to want to list the number of households that receive more than one type of assistance. Again, this is only with your HOPWA funding coming from DHCD, not from any other source. So that is what you put there in row 21. Alrighty. So that's all for supportive services. Other competitive activity, again, this is not something that we fund through DHCD HOPWA funding, so you do not need to complete that, and you can move on to ACT and totals. So at the top here, in row 1, these are the activities that you have completed tabs for. And in row 2, these are all pre-populated based on the information provided on those specific tabs, corresponding tabs. Excuse me. If any of these numbers are incorrect, you must go back to that tab. Let's say the number here for TBRA were incorrect, then you would have to go to TBRA and find the total household served with the assistance here, and that's where the correction would need to be made. It cannot be made on the ACT and totals tab. So that's across the board there. In row 4, here you the total amount of housing subsidy. This is row is auto-populated by adding up all the housing subsidy assistance and should not be used as a reference for your total eligible household count. So that is only looking at the housing assistance, which is TBRA, STRUMU, and permanent housing placement. It will then calculate the unduplicated housing subsidy assistance households. Over here, you will see that it is going to also populate over here in column I from the tab for demographics from row 27. It's going to give you that number, and that number should be the same as I believe Lindsay, you might need to help me out real quick.
6, yeah.
6.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So row 27 here and row 6 here, the number should be the same. Thank you. Okay, then let's see here. In rows 10 through 15 here, you are going to provide the number reported on each of these rows individually cannot be greater then row 6. So when you are looking at those who received a unduplicated housing a subsidy, then those reported here, 10 through 15, cannot be greater than that number. Previously, you would have had instructions that said that these needed to be the same number. However, the instructions now are this information is only going to be those who received a housing subsidy and a support service or case management, which is a type of support service, if those funds were from the HOPWA funding that you received through DHCD. And as we're finishing up, you do not need to complete the capital development. That is not something that we fund through with our HOPWA funds through DHCD. And if you have the information, this is something that we should be collecting now. So make sure if you have any information on emergency transfers due to domestic violence, sexual assault, that information gets reported here in the VAWA category. All right. I am going to stop sharing, and Lindsay is going to finish us up just as soon as I stop sharing my screen. Here we go. All right, Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, are you able to see the PowerPoint? Good. Okay. So just as a reminder, many of you have done this before, but we do use CAMS to collect the initial workbooks. So you will need to go into CAMS to submit that. While they're being emailed to you initially, CAMS is where you will be uploading those reports once you have completed them. And you can find them on your current year HOPWA project listed under the Reports and Communication tab. And it's a very simple, straightforward report that's been assigned in CAMS. It looks like this, and you would just be choosing your file and uploading it there on your project. So the workflow for these CAPER workbooks is that workbooks and instructions will be sent to you. You will complete the workbooks using the data from all the households that you have served through this July 1st of 2025 through June 30th of 2026. They will be uploaded into CAMS by you. Our HOPWA program administrator is going to do an initial check to make sure they're complete and accept or deny reports. In that case, the report would be denied only if it's not 100% complete.
And we'll make a correction here for future PowerPoints for CAMS and not CAMA, but it is via CAMS.
Yeah, okay, yes, that is true. And then once we have a complete workbook, we have a next level of review where we will be looking for correctness. And then if there's anything that needs to be looked at by you or corrected or updated, you will receive instructions from the housing data manager with exactly what you need to do to get that corrected. So important dates, we will have one office hour session starting at 2 o'clock on July 22nd. It's not going to be this presentation again. It's simply going to be, we will be there online, ready to answer any questions that you might have. So that's an opportunity to, to reach out to us to get your questions answered. Workbooks are due uploaded in CAMS by the 31st of July. So with that, I will leave you the contact information for Andrea, who is the homeless data manager. And hopefully if you have any questions, you can join us on July 22nd. Thanks. Did you stop?